Well, welcome to session 7 of our course in Apologetics for the 21st Century. It doesn't seem possible to me that we've already reached this second to the last module before the course is finished. And I hope you've had a very interesting time. I hope that this has gone, maybe not quickly for you, but that the time has passed in a way that has been pleasant and has been actually very, very helpful to your ongoing faith and service to Jesus Christ. That's what this is all about. So in this module, we're going to be talking about the questions that have been leveled at Christian faith by people from the disciplines of history and archaeology. Do they support what the Bible says, and do they support the claims of Christian faith, or do they tend to cast doubt upon it? And there have been some criticisms that we need to deal with that will help us to do a better job of explaining and defending our faith towards those who have questions. So let's see what we can accomplish in this particular session. There have been two forms of criticism regarding the Christian faith from a historical and or archaeological basis. The first one is fairly straightforward. The claim would be, and I'm not saying that I believe this or that you should, but the claim has been that Christian faith has been disproved because history and archaeology show that the Bible contains dozens of significant historical errors. So in other words, people have said, basically the Bible, it can't be trusted, Christian faith can't be trusted because history and archaeology show too many contradictions between the actual record and what the Bible claims. The second one I think is even more serious than this one. The second one is an attack really on history itself. There are those who would say that you can't really write an accurate history, that history really isn't possible because it's all a matter of interpretation, that history is unreliable because it depends upon biased people to write it, people with an agenda, people who don't know all the facts, people who have their own ways of interpreting facts. And then they write faulty accounts. They don't write accurate accounts. So this is a lot more serious. The first one, you can argue the evidence. The second one basically says that you can't really interpret any evidence. So let's look at that, and let's proceed to see if any of these criticisms of Christian faith stand up to reason and evidence. So let's tackle the first one first, or excuse me, let's tackle the second one first, because it is, I think, the most basic of the criticisms, that you can't trust history. You can't write an accurate account of anything that happened, because it's all a matter of interpretation. This is a very postmodern view of things. Now, not all postmodernists believe this, but there are a significant number of people in postmodernism that will hold to this view, and we'll talk about postmodernism in the next and, of course, the final module. So this will be kind of a preview. But this is called historical deconstruction. Historical deconstruction holds that history is hopelessly unreliable due to the following factors. As I've said before, all history is written by fallible people. All of us are fallible. Nobody can know all the facts. Nobody can go back and find all the evidence. And secondly, all historians, all writers of history, all people who compile accounts of what happened in the past have some bias or agenda, and so they're definitely going to try to push their bias or their agenda. And such things as objective truth, hard historical facts, data in the records don't really exist. I mean, this is pretty serious. Basically, they're saying you can't know anything about the past. You can't reconstruct anything in the past with any accuracy because we don't have all the facts, because we all have some kind of bias or agenda, and because really, things like just facts don't exist. So let's see if we can deal with that really kind of dark and despairing view of being able to know anything about the past. That's what this really is. This idea would claim that what we call facts are only people's perceptions of reality, that all claims about facts are simply individual perceptions of reality. And my perceptions of reality may be very different than yours. My facts about the past may be different than your facts about the past. And that's really, it makes it impossible to even talk about anything. Can't talk about the past because we're dealing with a whole, each person has their own separate set of information that they're going off of. There's no common set of facts or data that you can argue about or that you can try to piece together in some sort of reasonable way. That everybody's got their own set of data, in other words. And this idea can be expressed in statements like, well, after a war, the victors get to write the history books. Now, there's some validity in this. Of course there is. I was interested to find out some years ago that our books, and I'm talking from an American perspective here, our history books about, for example, something like World War II, they're written from the perspective of people who were on the winning side of that war. That's true. And so we interpret events, both from the German and the Japanese perspective, in light of we Americans and how we saw it, how we experienced it. And I know that many historians try not to do that, and it's possible not to do that. But a lot of times, especially the books that are used in public schools, for example, or even private schools, will tend to be written from that perspective. Now, if you go to Germany or Japan, and you read whatever accounts they may have of those events, and from what I understand, they tend to not deal nearly so in depth. They don't spend nearly so much time on those events. Why? Because they're kind of embarrassed about it, or they just as soon move on and not dwell on those events. Because why? Because they lost the war. Because perhaps they're ashamed of some things that their nations did in the past. And why would you want to spend a lot of time talking about something that you're not pleased about, that you're not proud of? And so certainly the history books are going to come at this from a different point of view. Can you imagine an Israeli textbook on the Second World War and how that deals with with Nazi Germany? It's going to be written from a particular perspective, and you can't, there's no way to get away from this because people do that. Does that mean that the facts that they record are necessarily wrong? Because I would guess that some of the facts at least are going to be the same no matter which one of these scenarios we look at. I mean, the fact that that Germany invaded Poland in 1939, and that kind of kicked off the Second World War, at least in Europe. I'm pretty sure an Israeli textbook is going to record that, and an American textbook is going to record that, and a German textbook is going to record that. Those facts are there. You can find the evidence that shows that happened. You can also find the fact that the war ended in May of 1945. You can find the fact that the Japanese launched an attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. I mean, there are some basic facts that no matter what perspective you're writing from, those facts aren't going to change, unless you're just playing with the facts. I mean, people can play with the facts, they can deny facts. Certainly that's possible. But the fact that people write from a perspective doesn't necessarily mean that they've got their facts wrong. You just have to understand what perspective history is being written from and take that into account. Another expression of this is that written history is just a means that oppressors use to impose their views and power. So in other words, history is just a tool for consolidating power. And that's also true. We know that that people who gain power write or cause history books to be written, cause records to be kept in a way that protects their power. For example, if you went to the Soviet Union and took a history class in the Soviet Union, it would be written clearly, at least part of it. And I'm not saying that the facts would be changed necessarily, but you have to understand that the Soviet Union wrote history, that people in the Soviet Union wrote history under the sponsorship of the Marxist communist government, socialist government in the Soviet Union, in a way that tended to support their point of view, their power, and so forth. And so that's clearly true, and I'm sure that we do that in the West as well. So again, it doesn't mean that the facts are wrong. It just means that they're arranged in a way that tend to support a particular group of people or a particular system that's in power. And when you read history, you just have to take that into account. You have to account for bias. And now, does that mean that all historians do that? Well, I would probably say that to a degree, it's impossible not to do that. But it is possible to write history knowing your bias and trying to factor out your bias. It's possible to deal with the historical facts in a way that I deliberately am not trying to write it from the perspective of my own country, my own history, my own background, my own people. So there are historians who tend to write history understanding their own bias and trying to factor out their own bias. And that is the kind of history that you really want to read, because it's the best kind of history. It's the best way to understand all of the perspectives without trying to push an agenda. For example, some feminists claim that history has been a tool that males have used to oppress women. So in radical feminist deconstructionist views of history, feminist writers will say, they'll claim that, most of the history writers in history were males. Males want to stay dominant over females, and so they tend to leave the achievements of women out. They tend to write history in a way that makes women stay in their place. All of that sort of thing. And again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily completely false. That may be partially true. But once again, that doesn't mean that accurate history, that reasonably unbiased history cannot be written. And it doesn't mean that you have to look at all history writers as, okay, what's their angle? What are they trying to do? That doesn't, all history writers don't necessarily have an agenda that they're deliberately trying to push. So otherwise, we just kind of give up and just say that everybody's got their angle, and it's all a power play. That's what this boils down to. This argument boils down to that it's all a power play. Which leads you to believe that, what if the feminists were writing the history? Would that be a power play as well? So it really does kind of reduce. It's a very cynical view of history, that it's all just to get people in power and to keep that power. So responding to the deconstructionist view, I've done some of that already. The idea that history is merely somebody's spin on events, if you really think about it, you can't even talk about what happened yesterday in your own life. If what the critics of history have said, you can't talk about what happened yesterday in your own life with any accuracy. There's no use, going to a court of law and trying to find out what really happened in some event or some crime, because nobody can reconstruct the past. Everybody's got an angle. It's all a power play. It's all whichever lawyer has the best argument. It's all whichever person can convince the others that their story is the best. Then really it's reduced to what is called sophistry. It's the best argument. It's the most convincing spin, and then people just vote on what they like the best. And then you have no history. It's all just persuasion and manipulation. So, for instance, if human events are purely a matter of individual interpretation, even something as routine as what or who caused a minor traffic accident could not be resolved. So let's say there's a fender bender, and the police arrive on the scene to figure out, what happened here. Well, then it's just basically one person's argument over another, and evidence doesn't really matter. You can reinterpret the evidence. And whoever's got the best argument wins. Well, of course, we can't live that way. We have to be able to say that the evidence shows that this particular person was mainly at fault, or these particular events like the weather, the icy roads, or something like that was the main cause of the accident. Otherwise, it reduces it all to argument, manipulation, and spin. And that would be a very scary world to live in. And I don't think any of us really believe that. Especially, somebody breaks into your house, you're going to want to argue what you consider to be the facts, and not just think that, hopefully the person who broke into your house doesn't have a better lawyer than you and can spin the facts better than you can. We don't believe that we believe that that's a very dishonest way of looking at the world. And it is quite true that historians tend to feature certain aspects of history over others, depending upon what the historian feels is important. For example, religious, you can write religious history. So you can say, okay, religion, let's say the development of Christianity over the centuries. Let's say that's my main focus, and I'm going to write a history of that. And so you're gonna look at how Christianity developed in the world, and you're going to deal with world events, other world events, trade, politics, weather conditions. You're going to deal with all of that are factors in the way human society developed, but you're going to be looking at it from how Christianity developed over the centuries. That's going to be your main focus. And so history is going to be seen from that particular focus or perspective. Or you can write a political history. And again, politics is going to be the driving focus of how you organize the events of the past. Or social, you can talk about social interactions, or gender. You can write gender history, of course you can. You can write economic history. You can write military history. You can write ethnic history. But whatever focus that a person has, you're going to organize the historical facts around that particular organizing focus. There's nothing wrong with this. This is how we have to do it. It would be impossible to write a full and complete history of anything, because full and complete history has to do with what people had for breakfast, or argument that one neighbor had with another, or somebody's dog got loose. All of those little events all contribute to the picture of a complete history. Well, nobody can do that. It's impossible to record all of those events. So you've got to organize your facts around a particular focus, and where you're going to be going with that. That's just the way you have to do it. Nothing unreasonable about it. You just have to know that that's happening. And the fact that Christians wrote their history, and organized their history around their particular focus, of course they're going to do that. That's the whole purpose of what they're doing. I mean, even Luke tells us in the Gospel of Luke that he carefully interviewed people. He carefully went around and talked to people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, because Luke himself was not there in the life of Jesus. Luke comes along later in Christian history. But Luke said he went around and gathered information from people, and then he was able to tell the story of Jesus with great accuracy. Well, what was his purpose? Was he trying to write a history of the Roman Empire? Of course not. He wasn't. That wasn't his purpose. Was he trying to talk about daily life in the first century in Judea? No, that wasn't his purpose. He was trying to tell the story of Jesus, but he was trying to gather the facts that would make that story accurate, reasonable, and reliable. And that's what a historian always does. So even understanding that agenda and even spin always play a part in history writing, basic facts behind historical events can be found and properly interpreted. You can really interpret the facts accurately. There are ways of doing that. The legal system basically writes history. They reconstruct events in the past to try to find out what actually happened from a certain perspective. What happened in relationship to these particular events involving these particular people. That's what they do. And, there are ways of finding out accurate facts. So reasonable historians, as well as the legal system, have developed various means of validating factual events. What do they use? Well, they use documents, written records, reports, photos, data from the internet these days, fingerprints, all those kinds of things. Well, actually, fingerprints would be physical evidence. Then there's eyewitness testimony, people who were actually there and saw things. Now, people can lie about what they saw, or people can be mistaken about what they saw, but that's the point of, people being cross-examined in a court of law, or historians taking eyewitness evidence and trying to evaluate, is this person telling the truth? Is this record accurate? Or was somebody mistaken? Whatever. There are ways that are fairly tried and true that historians and the legal system use to try to determine whether the information they're getting is accurate. Physical evidence, as I said, fingerprints or blood, in the case of a crime, or skid marks, from an accident, or even things like archaeological evidence. We'll talk about that coming up, but you can look at what people find in terms of evidence relating to the historical event and say, does this broaden our view? Does this clarify our view? Does this confuse our view? And if it confuses our view, then maybe we need to revise our view to account for this new evidence. And so there are ways we use all the time to try to determine the accuracy of what we're being told about the past. And to a lesser extent, logic and rational argument can fill the gaps not supplied by hard evidence. So when you don't have any evidence, or when you have a gap in your evidence, you say, okay, well, here's the evidence we do have about the past. What reasonable scenario can I come up with in my head that will account for all the evidence we actually have to make some kind of clear picture about the past? And I include the physical evidence, I include the documents, I include the eyewitness accounts, everything I've got. How do I put all this together and come up with something that could be a reasonable account of what happened in the past? So with this background in mind, we can answer the first question posed in this session. Does history tend to confirm or deny the claims made by the Christian faith? Claims made by the Christian message cannot all be validated because some of them are outside the realm of evidence, such as history and archaeology are not going to have anything to say about how the universe was created because nobody was there to observe it. I suppose there is some hard evidence for that, but again, it's controversial, and people have a hard time making sense out of the Big Bang or whatever evidence there may be. The concept of the Trinity. I mean, history and archaeology, there's just no way they can comment on whether God is a Trinity or not, or whether Jesus was God or not. That's outside the realm of history and archaeology. Now, there may be some hints from history that if you understand, some of the things Jesus did, it might lead you to the belief that Jesus was God in human flesh. But history itself can't produce hard evidence to prove that necessarily. Now, I know there have been some people that have tried to do that, but again, it's pretty hard. However, many claims can be tested historically. Whether certain people existed that are claimed as part of the Christian message, whether Jesus existed, whether Pontius Pilate existed, whether all these other people existed, can be confirmed by history and archaeology. Certain events, certain places recorded in the Bible can be specifically confirmed, as well as more generally through the evidence of history itself. The documentary evidence comes from the records of testimonies of eyewitnesses. These eyewitness accounts can be divided into two types. First, there's the testimony of believers, people who are Christians or who, are arguing the case for Christianity. There's some evidence there. Again, you've got to evaluate whether they're giving accurate accounts. And then there's the testimony of others outside the realm of believers. Again, you've got to examine that as well. The four gospel accounts, when it comes to the life of Jesus, present the testimony of various people who claim that they personally saw and experienced events in the life of Jesus. So Matthew and John are the two of the gospel writers that were actually there. They were disciples of Jesus. They were following him around. Mark and Luke were not. Both Mark and Luke became followers of Jesus after the resurrection, so they didn't necessarily see the events of Jesus' life on earth themselves, but they gathered information from those who did. And so, their accounts also represent eyewitness testimony because they're interviewing eyewitnesses or they're representing eyewitnesses. Apostles like Peter and Paul claim they experienced certain things in their New Testament writings after the time. Well, Peter was actually a disciple as well, but in his writings, he's talking about things that happened also after the time of Jesus' resurrection. Christian writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, called patristic writings, support the statements of the New Testament writers. So in the generations following the 1st century, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation Christians, their writings tend to also give some evidence about what happened in their recent past. There are several ancient writers which tend to confirm certain details of the biblical record who are not believers. For example, Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny, Lucian, and so on. Now, there's more detail about their evidence back in Module 4, so if you want to review that, you're welcome to do that. The testimony of ancient sources can be tested using accepted criteria to determine credibility, such as, what did these people, the records that they left behind, either as believers or critics of the Christian faith, or people who are just recording events, whether they're critical or not. What did they have to gain or lose? I mean, what were they pushing an agenda? Because it's possible to do that. And does the information we have about the source support their claim? Does it make them credible or maybe not so believable? Here are examples of criteria used to determine credibility. For example, the apostles who are arguing for Jesus and all the events he did, all the miracles he did, the fact that he was the Son of God, his resurrection, all of that. If they had made up the story of Jesus' life and resurrection, okay, think about it. What did they stand to gain from this? If it's all about power and gaining status and wealth or whatever, as some people claim that history is, and that some people specifically claim the early Christians were all about that. That's all this is just personal agenda. But why would they suffer and die for this? Did it work out real well for them? Was this something that improved their status and power? Well, you could argue, well, Peter became head of the church, and so he had a certain amount of power over people. I don't know if Peter thought it was worth it, honestly. You look back at that and you just think, I don't know. It just doesn't seem to make sense. And even if there is somebody who's willing to, suffer a lot in their life as long as they have power over a small group of people, it doesn't seem like a lot of people are willing to do that. And you see all of the early disciples of Jesus going through that and with their dying breath affirming what they have always believed about Jesus. So that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Does their testimony sound like the kind of stories that deluded or naive people are prone to tell? I mean, do they seem like foolish people? Do they seem like weird people? Do they seem like people that you couldn't trust? That's a big issue. And we all know that there are untrustworthy people in the world, con artists, people who are good at persuading folks that, to follow them or whatever. Do these people seem that way? In my opinion, they don't. It seems like they're just people trying to persuade you of something that they believe very strongly about. If, as some critics claim, the Bible was written by Christian leaders of a later generation, say the 2nd, 3rd, 4th generations of Christians, in order to give credence to their beliefs, what evidence is there to support that idea? And I can answer that very quickly. There is no evidence. The accounts that we have go back to right after, the documents we have of the life of Jesus and the New Testament go back to the time just right after, a few years after the last of the apostles died. and it seems to represent, it truly represents their writings, their thoughts. So this idea that 2 or 3 or 4 generations after the time of Jesus and the apostles, some people got together and they took what little evidence there was and they cooked up this fantastic story so they could gain power over people. It just doesn't seem to hold any weight. For one thing, the persecution continued for 300 years after the time of Jesus. So the second, third, fourth generations, they didn't have a lot to gain by cooking up some story. They suffered right along with the rest. And the documents, the historical evidence doesn't support that idea at all. Do the writings of others who lived close to the times in question confirm the accuracy of these accounts? And of course, the answer is yes. Even non-Christian writers tend to support at least some of the basic claims made by the New Testament writers. So here are some logical arguments to fill in the gaps not supplied by the hard facts. First, it's unlikely that the resurrection story or the rest of the stories about Jesus' life, or even events before Jesus' life in the Old Testament, or events later on in the rest of the New Testament, it's unlikely that these stories would have been so widely believed when simply producing a dead Jesus. Let's put the body of Jesus on display. That would have just kind of totally wiped out any rumors about the resurrection, or evidence that the disciples were lying or were prone to lie would have tended to discredit the story. And none of that happened. Nobody ever produced the body of Jesus. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove his resurrection, but it also, it would have been an easy way to disprove it if people had found the body. And you kind of wonder how the disciples, in a time during Passover when Jesus was crucified, how in the world would you hide a body in a crowded city without somebody coming forward and saying, you know what, I saw these guys carrying a body and they hid it here. It just doesn't seem like, nobody stepped forward. So it tends to show, and the fact that, the Christian message really took off and was unstoppable afterwards, that tended to give credence to the fact that it was hard to explain the empty tomb. It was hard to deny that something really amazing had happened. Anyway, the change in attitude and behavior of the disciples from before the resurrection to afterwards, and I'm just using the resurrection as an example here. The disciples were discouraged, they were despondent, they were hiding, they were afraid, until the resurrection happened. And you can see the change in just a short period of time, almost overnight, from these, defeated men to men that you basically had to kill them to stop them. And they turned the world upside down, which is literally what the Romans said, that these people are turning the world upside down because they were so confident about their message. How about the evidence of the changed life of Saul of Tarsus, who initially was a persecutor of Christians and later became the great champion of the Christian message among non-Jewish people, Gentile people? And then the survival of the early Christian movement. I mean, how many times did the Roman Empire try to stamp out Christianity? A lot of times it was pretty half-hearted, their attempts, but there were times when it was a fairly concerted effort. 2 or 3 times in the 300 years that Rome was trying to persecute Christianity, they made a real effort to do it. They just couldn't do it. In fact, what happened was the Christians grew in number, even during the times of severe persecution. Well, again, that doesn't necessarily prove that Christianity is true, but it surely proves that there were a lot of people who sincerely believed this and were willing to die for it, and were really not gaining anything in terms of earthly power. They weren't getting rich on it. They weren't taking positions of authority on it. They were dying. So this is something you have to take into account. The physical evidence used to examine the claims of the Bible comes from the discipline of archaeology. Boy, I've spelled archaeology a couple different ways here, so I'll have to go back and change that, but just pardon me. The real spelling is in the first paragraph in this slide. Biblical archaeology discovers and evaluates artifacts relating to the Bible. And it's not an exact science, but it can interpret the evidence it finds in an effort to reconstruct the history of the times from which the artifacts came. So you can take the things you dig up in the ground or whatever, and it gives you more evidence to deal with in terms of what happened um, related to those events. In the past 150 years of archaeological investigation, several prominent archaeologists have been convinced that the evidence tends to confirm the biblical record. Now, there have been those that deny it, and there are everything from people who are somewhat critical, somewhat skeptical, to those who basically say the Bible has little or nothing to tell us. Those are called biblical minimalists. And I won't mention, a lot of names here because they won't mean much to most people. But I'm going to talk about the people who do tend to think that the Bible has a very accurate, that archaeology does tend to support the Bible. William Foxwright, Albright, and Nelson Glick. Here's what they say. Here's what Albright said. He said, the excessive skepticism shown toward the Bible has been progressively discredited. Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history. Nelson Glick, a Jewish archaeologist, wrote, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted or disproved a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail historical statements in the Bible. So, by no means does the whole field of archaeology discredit the Bible. Or let me put it this way, by no means do all archaeologists who study the Bible, they're not all skeptical. Some are, some aren't. And I've quoted the ones that are not skeptical. So here's a sampling of the archaeological evidence. The legendary evidence of a catastrophic worldwide. Actually, this first one is not archaeological. This first one is comes from folklore and human culture. The legendary evidence of a catastrophic worldwide flood from cultures widely scattered around the globe. You can go from Polynesia, that would be the Hawaiian Islands, the Tahitians, the Marquesas, and so on. They have legends of a worldwide flood, and interestingly enough, the leader of the family that survived the flood was named Noah, or some version of that name. Interesting. Was that just brought, as some people claim, by missionaries, and they picked up the story? It seems to be that those stories were already there before the missionaries got there. And of course, they're by no means unusual. Go to almost you can go to every continent on the earth and find a culture of people that have had some version of a flood story from long before Christianity made contact with them. Now the stories differ in detail, and a lot of the details of the story are different, but a flood story is very universal in the human race. Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization. The Bible says that, everything started in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in modern day Iraq. That's what the Bible says. What does history tell us? Well, the earliest civilization that we know anything about started right in that region. The Ebla tablets and the Amarna tablets, the Nuzi tablets, these are all collections of documents, basically written on clay tablets in cuneiform writing, that if you look through all of the data that they give, and most of those things are commercial documents, the sale of one thing, how much somebody paid for this or that, legal records, those sorts of things. So a lot of it is, doesn't have to do so much with the Bible itself, but what it does give us is a picture of the times that the Bible talks about, and it tends to confirm that people lived during those times, much like the Bible says those people lived. And also, once in a while, you find something in there that actually does correlate with some claim that the Bible makes, like the name of a ruler, or the name of a group of people, or some battle that was fought, tends to confirm what the Bible says. Garstang was back in the 20s, and I know that's a long time ago, 1920s, um, made some findings, and his findings in Jericho tended to confirm what the book of Joshua says about the Israelite conquest of Jericho. And I happened to be there in 2015. My wife and I were there at Jericho and looked at some of the places where Garstang was digging, and actually, I was kind of surprised at how little had been done over the years. Garstang was one of the ones who did try to do some major excavation there. There was and he believed that it confirmed everything that Joshua said, down to how the walls collapsed, down to the fact that the city was not looted, and there were large um, storage areas where grain was kept, and the grain was still there, although it was burned. But it hadn't been looted, just like the Bible said. Now there have been other archaeologists who've been there since, like Kathleen Kenyon in the 40s and 50s, and she tended to deny that the biblical count was accurate. She tended to say that Garstang had misinterpreted the evidence, and yet she seemed to be digging in places where you wouldn't necessarily find what the book of Joshua talks about. She was digging in places that wouldn't necessarily show any evidence related to that. So, it's one of those things where, again, archaeologists have their own interpretation, and it's interesting what the media picks up on. The media never talks about Garstang in the 20s. It always talks about Kenyon in the 50s. Why? Because I think most people in the media are skeptical of the Bible, and Kenyon tended to support their skeptical view. Garstang would obviously not. And then there have been excavations since Kenyon which have tended to then swing the pendulum back towards saying that what Garstang found was actually pretty accurate. So once again, you just have to take all that with a grain of salt. Then there was something as small as the seal of Jeremiah's scribe Baruch, which in and of itself is not a big deal, but it just goes to show that there was someone writing during the time of Jeremiah whose name was Baruch, who had the father and the grandfather that he did, and that the seal was found in a place where you'd expect Jeremiah's scribe to have left it, in that part of Jerusalem. So, once again, some findings can really be helpful. So how do we conclude this? Past events can be reconstructed and accurately interpreted to form a reliable account. History is possible. Accurate history is possible. There are proven methods for sorting out bad history or biased history from accurate history. So in other words, you can recognize when somebody's writing biased history and when somebody's writing accurate history. And archaeology can be a helpful tool in examining physical evidence from past events in order to offer a more complete view of what took place. So archaeology is helpful. Sometimes it shows you evidence that you wouldn't have found any other way. So, while history and archaeology often have no means of confirming supernatural or theological claims in the Bible, they do tend to support the statements of the Bible in terms of the record of human and natural events. I hope this session has been helpful. We'll see you in the final session when we talk about postmodernism.